Well, Mike, we're live.
We are live, and I've failed to put out my slick new virtual background. I feel like a weirdo without it.
I mean, we just spent all of 90 seconds preparing for the show.
We did.
You wasted all of that time?
Well, and the worst part is, so like, this is my work computer. I'm at work. I'm at the office, as you just saw. And I do this show every day or most days, and I do other Zooms. And so I've become very diligent about turning off the virtual background and referring to myself as Hot Mike number 3 or Mike Loaf, because the default when starting a meeting are the settings from your last meeting. And so I started one yesterday with Mike Loaf behind me, and thankfully it wasn't a client, but the person that was we're on the Zoom with was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I love our fact-checking team here. The fact-checking team, Fifi and Jaden, make it into several of my Zoom meetings with clients because of the same thing. I turned them on, I think, when we had conspiracy theorist number 2 or 3 on the show. And I brought them on and I never turned it off. And actually a handful of my clients are like, can you turn back the one on with the kids? Because that's my favorite. So it worked out in my favor. But instead of riffing about Zoom backgrounds, which I'm sure is, compelling for everybody, should we start the show?
Yeah.
Welcome to Hot Lou Happy Hour. I am your host, Lou Abramowski, or somewhat bountifully known as Hot Lou.
I am Mike Loaf.
It's about time I got one right and you didn't.
I'm usually pretty good.
Yeah, I feel like you get a little bit more time to think. Well, I always think about it, then I forget. We start the show, and then I try to improv it, and then 30% of the time it just completely tanks. And then you're always ready.
I'm always ready. Actually, that smacks of preparedness. I'm always, my brain is just wired that way to get that one right about 90% of the time.
Yeah. I don't know if you recall this, but back in our senior year of high school, I can't remember the timeline exactly, but remember we took over the local radio station, you, me, and Nick Samowski. And I remember I wrote out a script for like the segments that I wanted to try to hit, and I was going to read them. And I remember the just absolute look of horror on both yours and Nick's face that I wanted to script it, and you were like, why?
Talk radio, brother.
Yeah, exactly. So you've always been prepared for these improv moments where, ironically, I was a preparer back then.
In many ways, I've chosen my career path very poorly, where much of my career does call for preparation, and I'm just kind of a shoot from the hip kind of guy.
And I'll tell you, I have fully converted because I had a really bad public speaking moment about 10 years ago or something, where I had it all prepared. I had practiced thoroughly, and then my mind just went blank in the middle of it. And it occurred to me at that point that I just need to know the information so thoroughly on whatever I'm talking about that if I completely forget, I can just fill the time just on what I know and be able to improv it.
Or be totally comfortable just spewing bullshit out of your mouth. Because working in politics for almost 20 years gets you pretty comfortable on that front.
Yeah, that harkens back to when we had Pat Garofalo on the show. Not that I'm calling what he had to say is bullshit, but I recall, because he was one of our first guests, if not our very first guest, that we had asked him ahead of time, like, is there anything we should hit or that we shouldn't hit? And he's like, I've been doing this for 15 years. You can't surprise me with any question that I'm not prepared to answer.
Yeah, no, but that's right. There's a learned skill in politics about. And it's not like you go to school for this, right? But I mean, there's a learned skill in politics, and it's referred to as answer the question you want to answer, not the question you were asked. And the very skilled politicians can easily do that, such that you won't even know that you're being that the wrong question has been asked and answered. Actually, I'm thinking out loud. I think we're going to go somewhere later in the show, which is going to give me an awesome opportunity to show how not to do that.
Exactly. Well, let's get back to our I'm sure what the lunatics have been waiting for a long time is to talk a little bit of coronavirus stuff.
Oh man, it was where we got our start, Lou.
Yeah, are people having corona withdrawal? Is that a thing?
I would think so. I absolutely think that corona withdrawal. I mean, look, we had the coronavirus pandemic / panic. Then we got into right around Memorial Day. We got into racial politics, and coronavirus went out the window. COVID was over. We declared it on the show. It was over. And so now I've noticed in this past week, everyone in the media, entertainment complex, government complex, it's all the same thing, has just reverted back to about April 15th-ish in their level of panic and concern over COVID. And it is scary, but it's kind of amusing in a way. If you, like me, just process politics and the media surrounding it as an Uber reality show, for which we have the perfect top star, it is amusing.
Yeah, it strikes me that the number one symptom of COVID withdrawal is the press desperately seeking more panic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had that panic in, I mean, weeks, almost 2 weeks.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, I would say about that.
We are being strongly encouraged to panic once again, up to and including, I believe, or I have heard, the rumors in the bushes are that today the Minnesota governor will require mask wearing in all public places statewide. Which again, I'm in St. Paul as we sit. I actually have not been to. I believe you're in Minneapolis. I have not been to Minneapolis, not one time since the pandy started. You know, those two cities together and their immediate outskirts comprise about half, a little less than half of the state's population. Makes a lot of sense in dense public areas, or when you're going into a grocery store, a restaurant, things like that, to wear. Former Governor Tim Pawlenty just tweeted today, basically be kind to each other, and being kind means wearing a mask in indoor places. I fully accept that it's very much common sense, but I do not like mandates, and I don't know that the guy, the farmer in Wadena, who's filling up his gas tank on his tractor, needs to wear a mask inside the station.
Yeah, particularly, I listened earlier this morning to Dr. Fauci appeared again on one of my favorite podcasts, and we'll try to put this in the show notes, but Science Versus, a Gimlet podcast by, I think, a very endearing woman from Australia who runs that show. She's awesome. She's always super lighthearted. She kind of inspires this show, or at least me on this show, to remain lighthearted about very serious topics. But it's amazing that she had Dr. Fauci on now multiple times. Mm-hmm. And just to be lighthearted about that kindness, and that, like, the seriousness of wearing a mask in rural Montana versus the subway in New York City, there's a big difference there. But Fauci really went through and talked about, and we talked about on the show, there's this Pascal's wager thing, that we don't know the future of the virus. We put together these really, frankly, shitty models that we hope kind of predict it, but in some ways we want them to be more serious, because if we way under prepare, then it's going to be really bad. But if we over prepare and premature closings happen, then it hurts humanity in different ways. So we talked about that, like, all paths lead to harm. I've said that since kind of the beginning.
Said that since the beginning.
And
we're doing the greatest hits here today.
Yeah, and I think that's still true. And there's no denying that that's sad. But to pretend that there's some easy solution, like not wearing masks because masks don't filter the coronavirus, like the cost benefit analysis on that, being wrong if you decide not to wear a mask, like could cost somebody their life. But,
As we
you know,
as we've talked about, part of this, I mean, obviously everything's political today, and I was glancing at a 537 post about how,
yeah,
in 2008, Democrats and Republicans looked at the recession of 2008 basically identically. And in 2020, there's a huge partisan gap on the sort of public opinion of the state of the economy that I predict will totally flip after the election if Joe Biden's elected.
oh yeah,
Right now, Republicans have largely gone back to pre-pandemic levels of optimism on the economy, and Democrats had a pretty dramatic drop, as everyone did, Democrats and Republicans alike, but they've stayed very pessimistic on the economy. So we can't even obviously agree on the terms. We can't even agree on the basics, and the economy is objectively terrible. I mean, that's the opening line of the article. The economy is coming back. It seems like more of a V-shaped recovery than maybe we would have thought 2 or 3 months ago. But we still have Great Depression level unemployment. We've added something like $4 trillion in hard numbers to our national debt, which is unthinkable. I think the entire national debt didn't hit $4 trillion until like 2000. I mean, it's just.
no.
It's unbelievable. It might be a little earlier than that, but it's basically unthinkable what we've done to our longstanding economy. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating about this week in particular, there's a couple things. The first is we're talking about the panic, and we're seeing, without question, a sort of, you want to call it a second wave, or at least a dramatic increase in number of cases. And that seems to be what's prompting this level of concern and analysis on our 24-hour-a-day media and in social media. But what I haven't seen yet, and I, just to break out the greatest hits, redo the greatest hits from back in April, what I'm not hearing is the link to our chief public policy objective, which is to flatten the curve, which is to say, make sure that everyone who needs a hospital bed or an ICU has one. And I have not seen a single story, and in fact, I've seen the of some of these states, including Ron DeSantis, Florida, villain, hero, maybe villain again, expressly say we have plenty of ICU capacity. And digging into the numbers a little bit, it appears that what's driving this second wave is now there are many younger people that are being infected. The median age of coronavirus infection, COVID infection, is something like 36 now, whereas just a few weeks ago it was still in the 50s. So it's dropped dramatically, which signifies that a number of young people have become infected. Okay, well, we know that now because we have testing capacity. We didn't know that back in March. We were simply not able to test at the levels needed to use this information. But what we're, at least not yet, what we haven't seen is a run on the most precious, resource, which is our ICU capacity. And so I am not yet worried, like my bat friend here. I'm not yet particularly concerned that we need to overreact. Back to your point that, it's almost better to overreact than underreact. I think we're well past that phase. I think at first, in the fog of war, as it was, that might have been a prudent choice. We're now at a point where we've got a lot of experience with this, and we also have basically the fact that we're going to be living with this for some time, and we cannot panic and change our course every time there's a change in direction.
Yeah, the ICO capacity thing, like you said, I think repeatedly as we kind of review our greatest hits here, is that I think you outlined it actually very, very well. Maybe 2 weeks ago. Who knows? Like, what does time mean anymore, right?
Yeah, it doesn't.
But you had kind of pointed out that while it's true that our ICU capacity, we may like asymptotically approach what had been the historic ICU capacity, but the whole point of flattening the curve was to institute these systems so that we could extend the temporary ICU capacity by, who knows, turning empty dorm buildings into an ICU, or tents in the middle of Nokomis Park in Minneapolis into some sort of makeshift ICU. And you're right. While we're seeing cases, that cases number spike, in one sense, the president said something accurate that, yeah, more testing is going to end up with more positive results. But what we haven't seen is that alignment with seeing, did I share the right thing there?
Something
yeah,
about
I think so.
balls in Houston is what I saw.
Yeah.
If you'd be kind enough to turn on my screen sharing, that would be.
I'll do that in a moment. But we saw a report, I think over the weekend, that Houston was starting to panic over meeting or hitting capacity of their ICU. And I think that's what we've seen, right? We have 4 states now where things are really spiking, kind of what feels like predictably, right? Florida, we thought would spike. We thought it would happen a little bit sooner than this after the beaches reopened and bars and everything reopened. Texas, Arizona, California.
I'm really fascinated with the what I would call scapegoating bars and restaurants, social gatherings.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So there was this report where I think we've been critical, I think, of the press a little bit, probably not in great enough detail, but it's really fascinating when a reporter will, in the interest of looking like they created a scoop, get a story out without, looking into the finer details, because they're not, they don't consider, I wouldn't think that most of them in the industry consider themselves necessarily either a scientist nor a strong problem solver, but they're just trying to collect information and then report it out to the public. And if they can do it in a way that's going to get more views, it's going to make them look good as well as their paper. That's what happened. But somehow, some way, there was a miscommunication between the reporter and people reporting this, that this fell into that same category. Well, it's true that it is starting in Houston to look more like the former capacity for the ICUs. They've got tons and tons of opportunity to expand, so they're not super terrified at this point. And now I think Texas, Florida, Arizona are trying to potentially reclose or have some version of reclosing restaurants and bars.
Let's not fall into the trap of only mentioning red states, which the media only does obsessively.
Yeah, and I was actually going to go further. California, I think, is even going more aggressive, because I think they're already on a full mask mandate. Do you know if that's right?
I believe that's correct. I have not checked that out, but California has been, unlike those other states. And you made the comment that, once the bars and restaurants started reopening and beaches were open and stuff, I don't believe California really had that experience. I'm fairly confident that they were among the more locked down of states as far as that goes, and yet we're still seeing a resurgence. Now, it could be that people just disobeyed the orders.
That is what happened. So, and this is just anecdotally, but I have really good friends who live in San Diego, as well as a client of mine, and there happened to be a red tide in San Diego, which actually brought people out like crazy, because I can't remember if the red tide itself if it was correlated or causal or whatever. But do you know about the bioluminescent plankton in the ocean? Do you know what that is?
You can't say extrajudicial, but you can say bioluminescent.
Yeah. So, but it's the coolest thing. And for people who are locked in the Midwest, they don't know this. Bioluminescent plankton, when you kick the water, the plankton actually illuminates like a firefly.
Oh, so wow.
It looks like some nuclear tide came in, because if you kick the water, it starts to glow like a firefly.
Sure.
So of course, at night in California, especially in San Diego or wherever this red tide was happening, people were flooding the beach, despite the fact that the beaches were closed, and they were just disobeying there.
I was listening to a libertarian podcast this morning that was recommended to me from a friend, and one of the things that that I meant to actually get at in my diatribe there was the sort of lack of how do I say this, giving a fuck when government officials speak. And I know we've talked about it on the show, but the sort of ability to, or rather the confidence that people have that the government is looking out for you and is actually giving you good advice. I should look this up. I've not seen numbers on this. I have to think they're at an all-time low. I mean, and you talked about the crappy models we've used, and we were talking about there was a statistic that the number of fatalities across the United States yesterday was about 400 or something like that. It was one of the lowest days we've had since April, and at its peak, we were seeing that just from New York City, day over day. And so, why would then we've now got three months worth of experience where nobody in the media, entertainment, government complex has been willing to or able to stand up and say, you know what, we got some stuff wrong, we got some stuff right. Here's what we haven't seen any sort of modification in any considerable way of the analysis that goes into their rulings. Not necessarily the rulings, we're all opening up, that sort of thing, but we haven't really seen anybody go, all right, we're rethinking this. We're rethinking the way that we approach this. And I want to get to schools at some point, because this is going to be a really big deal in the next couple of weeks. And I think consequential probably for ever, or at least for a long time. I mean, if schools are not open, we can, but back to, kind of California, Florida, Arizona, it's just really interesting that sort of statistically, we had Memorial Day. And after Memorial Day, the day of, but the day after, when it kind of became public, we had George Floyd, and we had protests with tens of thousands of young people, some wearing masks, some not. And
in the densest cities across America.
In the densest cities across America, most of them were younger, say in the 20s and the teen cohort. And that is where we're seeing a spike. And I'm not seeing, absent my buddy Ben Shapiro, I'm not seeing anybody make that link. And oh, by the way, it might be okay to say that, gosh, as you and I said on the show, we're conducting a hell of a social experiment here. A bunch of people that are very likely to get infected. It sure seems now like they've gotten infected, and it's not really that bad.
Yeah. So a couple of things I wanted to point out on that, because you were able to steal my thunder, because we talked about it a little bit in our 90 seconds of show prep. But a couple of things that I want to point out for people is that I've stopped paying too much attention to the daily numbers, and I've started paying more attention to the 7-day rolling average numbers, specifically because what you'll notice is almost always on Sunday and Monday, the reports are always just dramatically low. Yep. And there's a really super simple explanation for that. It's because people aren't working on Saturday and Sunday.
Oh, interesting.
So, not that there aren't nurses and doctors and health officials working on those days, but the administrators who do the paperwork for that work your normal, Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 sort of shifts. So sometimes you'll see a spike on a Monday or a Tuesday after a Sunday and Monday is super low. So those rolling 7-day numbers are a little bit more reliable, and you don't see the gigantic shifts as much. And resident fact checker Josh Kimber, who has been noticeably absent the last couple of weeks, we need to bring him back in.
I hope he hasn't gotten the COVID.
Yeah. But speaking of which, I have somebody who has agreed to come on the show to talk about his experience having gotten tested positive and recovered, and people close to him got it from him. So hopefully having him on the show. But the stealing thunder part that I wanted to mention was that I think one of the big things that we are seeing is, the people who are arguing, if you're uncomfortable with coronavirus, just stay at home and take a bunch of extra precautions. I think we must be seeing that at a high level. And this is total speculation on my part. I have almost no data except anecdotal on this, but it has to do with the fact that protesters were mostly young. It has to do with the fact that we are seeing a huge spike in positive cases, despite the fact that I got distracted because that site that I just shared started playing audio. So let me back up here. We're seeing huge spikes in positive cases. We saw a bunch of mostly the young people out there protesting and congregating. And tons of them were wearing masks, but they were touching and they were close enough, and blah, blah, blah. But deaths aren't rising as sharply, or hospitalizations as sharply. And at least in Minnesota, and I think this is also true in the United States, the number one demographic for positive tests right now, the highest population, are people in their 20s.
Yeah, no, that's what we were getting at. And it would be very easy to scapegoat bars and restaurants because people in their 20s frequent bars and restaurants. And I'm not saying there's not something to that, but you wouldn't see these types of numbers. You wouldn't expect to see these types of numbers or I should say, you'd see them more uniformly. You wouldn't see them as densely compacted as they seem to be. These are not occurring in greater Minnesota, in rural parts of the country. These are in big cities. And big cities were also, so you probably can't peel the onion back too much because there's a lot going on at once with this. And don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not sitting here blaming the protests, but what we are saying is we had a lot of public health officials over the past month tell us that going to a protest was just fine. In fact, I think thousands of them were on record basically saying that if that protesting for racial equality, you should not have a concern over COVID infection if that's what you're trying to do, which is asinine, which the same people who are telling us follow the science, that is not science. There is nothing there. You will never, if I live another 50 years, which I'm not going to, you will never convince me that is correct. That is science. And to tie my points together, that in the last month, these public health officials have lost a ton of esteem and confidence because of statements like that, and they should. And so now, when these same, if there's going to be a new panic and a new pandemic or a new wave of the pandemic, and you see the Dr. Fauci's of the world, and I don't think he was credited with saying anything like that, but the folks who did, coming out and telling us we need to shelter in place and roll back our economic restrictions and things like that, there's not going to be nearly the level of deference to those officials than there was the first time, and frankly, there shouldn't be.
Yeah, maybe not. And it can be hard because on one hand you have, the boy crying wolf on that side of things, but there's also this Pascal's wager thing that I talked about, and trying to believe the worst case scenario if the cost is very little, although it did come at great cost, undeniably, to the economy, and who knows what kind of.
But what we learned, Lou, is largely that and this is back to what Tim Pawlenty said, if we can take care of each other, we can probably take care of each other a hell of a lot better than any kind of government order can do it if we wear masks and socially distance, because that's basically all you can do.
And you know what? I'll say that, I think a couple of things that we've been hinting at here that I wanted to go into is that one thing that you really haven't heard from public officials, I shouldn't say that, one thing I haven't heard, and I've looked a little bit for it, is that public officials haven't said, if you're young, you have to take fewer precautions and take extra, not extrajudiciously, extra distance from the people most vulnerable in your life. But I think that's what we're accidentally seeing by way of even some of the people who are even anti-mask wearers, who are maybe a little bit too far over on that side in anti-science, but they're saying if you're not comfortable, just stay away. Yeah. And if you're young, stay away from the people that are vulnerable. And I'm actually seeing anecdotally and within my friends group some of that happening. And I know I'm personally doing that. I think I said I went to go see my mom on Mother's Day, and I had literally seen nobody else other than going to the grocery store with a mask on. And I spent, I don't know, maybe a week and a half or something leading up to that. And right before I went up there, I cleaned out my car and I washed all my clothes and I took a shower in case I was carrying something on my clothes or whatever, not knowing. And then on top of that, we just hung out outside. Yep. So on top of everything else, which was painful for her. Cool. It was, we were wearing winter clothes to be outside. So I'm seeing a lot of that and despite the fact that it doesn't really seem that that advice is coming from public officials. But to your point about Palenti saying, we have the power to control this ourselves. And I think we've heard that from Fauci in maybe different terms, that, yeah, mask wearing, social distancing, and now this additional layer that seems to be kind of rising organically to stay away from the people that are most vulnerable if you're going out to the bars or protesting or licking toilet seats.
So I wanted to look forward, because this has been the topic around the campfire these past few nights, and for all the right reasons, is what the hell are we going to do with schools? And that is not I mean, this is it was a very complicated decision to move to all remote learning when it was made. Because you're not just dealing with the children, you're dealing with everyone the children see. You're dealing with a large staff in most public schools. Not just the teachers, but many vulnerable people work at schools. Janitors, lunch ladies, the people who work at the front desk. I mean, these are not all young, healthy people like we think about with kids. So this is, I'm giving a lot of deference to what happens here. But what I was not prepared for was was yesterday's news that, and I believe this was there was a testimony today in the U.S. Senate regarding this, but the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is the official organization of pediatricians, doctors who treat children, made a very strong statement about children needing to go back to school in person. And to anyone with children, this is 100% correct, that we should not pretend that distance learning is a thing. And I'm not saying like there's not some kid out there who got something from it. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is, for the vast majority of kids, that is not only is that not ideal, it's very harmful for them. And you're looking at the AAP basically says that. I think
I'm going to interrupt you because I want to say, and jump back in there, because I want to say one interesting thing about that's been on the back of my mind that I haven't seen people talk about, is I'm really wondering about the long-term effects to what already feels like a lagging education system in the United States, to potentially taking like a year of what is already behind the Japans of the world in our education system, and like
Japan,
putting it at,
I mean, we're like
everybody.
Back. Yeah,
exactly. And then what does that mean? Because Japan is like COVID's having almost no impact because none of them shake hands and they wear masks like crazy and have for a couple of decades.
Right.
And they're probably going to go back to school just fine. And I think they actually have year-round school, so it's probably already happening. Yep. But that's been on the back of my mind.
Well, so I mean, you nailed it with, I mean, if we look at the fall semester that's upcoming here without in-person schooling, that will be effectively a calendar year without schooling. And a year is a long time for a 41-year-old. But now do a 5-year-old, right? Or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, maybe a 12-year-old who is already at risk, maybe a 12-year-old who really can't follow a lesson on his computer, or whose home situation doesn't really lend itself to a learning environment, or whose parents are having to face going back to work with staying home to help their kid learn. And so, I mean, this is really complicated stuff, but also this child, this is from the AAP. Remote learning is likely to result in severe learning loss and increased social isolation. Social isolation, in turn, can breed serious social, emotional, and health issues. Child and adolescent physical or sexual abuse, substance abuse, depression, and suicidal ideation. Furthermore, these impacts will be visited more severely on Black and Brown children, as well as low-income children and those with learning disabilities. This is undeniably correct. And what I'm concerned about, and admittedly, I listened to a libertarian podcast this morning, so I just disqualify everything I said with that. But all of I intuitively believe this, I'm kind of a libertarian. I intuitively believe this already, but what's interesting is, as these public officials, and I'm talking now about the Minnesota Department of Education, I'm not talking about our local school districts, I'm talking about the state bureaucracy that manages these, and I'm sure the state bureaucracy in just about every state is going through this in the same way. The incentives are all in place to not go back to school. The teachers union would never consent to that, absent some pretty major and correctly so, as far as looking out for the safety and health of its members. Right? They should be an advocate to say to work from home. Right? However, the teachers unions are the single biggest funder of Democratic politicians in every state, and in particular in Minnesota. And Democratic politicians are the ones making these choices. So there's that. There is the fact that all of our entire public school apparatus, which, as you point out, is not really kicking all the ass that maybe it did in a prior generation, is entirely funded by property taxes. They face no shortage of funds from the decision to stay closed. So you have an economic incentive to stay closed. You have a public health or a employee health incentive to stay home. There's basically not very many people, even the non-union employees, who have lost any jobs because of this. Now compare that to a private school or most of our colleges and universities. Even if they're public, they're very heavily dependent on tuition, which is a choice that I get to make, right? I get to choose not to go to school or not to pay my tuition and just back out of that deal. I don't have that choice with public schools. So it's not an accident that all the universities and all the private schools are basically facing an extinction level event and reacting accordingly, being safe, being whatever, socially distant, yada, yada, that the public schools are not processing because they can't. It's not in their incentive to do so.
I'll be perfect. I'll be perfectly honest. Like, I'm afraid 25 years from now, we're going to have a president who can't read daily press briefings.
Not press briefings, policy briefings. Those are more
policy. Yeah, you're right. I should have. Yeah. God, I was so ready for that joke and I just blew it. Okay. But
serious. And like, I would, I think I've said this on the show. If not, I've said it to anybody who will listen. If you're a taxpayer, and I don't care if you have kids in the school or not, but especially if you have kids in the public school and you're paying, in Scott County, I pay something like $6,000 a year in property taxes. I imagine that rate is even higher in Ramsey County and in Hennepin County. You're paying largely that much, well, not largely, about a third of that goes to fund your public schools, and about which you are not getting any benefit, because I'm not fooling myself. Distance learning is not working, and it's not a thing that is not appropriate for children.
Well, I was reading all of those like symptoms of what might, or ailments or conditions that it might cause in children. I'm seeing that already from some of the parents. Like,
yeah,
you know, I mean, some of them are just not ready to do that sort of stuff, and it's no fault of their own. It's like you went from having a routine that you're maybe kind of relatively comfortable with to upending your life and doing a skill that you have absolutely no training in, and then to have a completely different relationship with your children. And I'm speaking as a bachelor with no children. I have to imagine, and I've witnessed it in many households, and yours too, that there's a little bit of added stress to that added
stress, and there. So as I understand it, the public schools are sort of evaluating and running three scenarios. Scenario one is 100% remote distance learning, at least for the fall semester, just like we did for spring semester 2020. The second scenario is fully back, maybe some social distancing and masks, which there's not a child in the world who will keep a mask on all day. That's just not going to happen. And you cannot keep kids socially distant. It is not, those are, we shall not bullshit ourselves about that, but they will try because it's politics. So scenario one over here, work from home, school from home. Scenario two, everything goes back to normal the way it was on Friday the 13th. And then scenario three is some kind of hybrid of that, about which there's very few details, which is probably what they're going to land on, because that's the way they balance all these equities. Some of our best lunatics are public school teachers. And if you're going to tell them, so let's say you're a public school teacher who lives in one district but teaches in another district and has two school-age children.
Who are getting distance taught by a different teacher.
Who are getting distance taught by a different teacher, but who now the school district may be required to have one of those kids in school in person 1 week and then home the following week. And that's what they're actually discussing.
Wow.
In order to keep the school population down, only having 50% or some percent of the students allowed in the building at any given time. So now you're that mom who is already having to work from home to teach her own class from home while her kids are distance learning from home, just probably right across the same table. Now you're going to put her in the position of she's going to have to be back in her classroom, but she's got kids at home, but they're distance learning, but distance learning isn't working. But next week he goes back in, but then the week after that, my other kid goes in. This is going to be a nightmare. You cannot do it this way. And by the way, that is not protecting anybody. I mean, the best rationale I can think of to keep the schools closed is not to protect the kids. It's to protect the staff. It's to protect the teachers and any vulnerable staff who may be there. I'm confident we could solve that problem. But by keeping 50% of the kids out of the school, you're doing nothing to solve that problem. And you're not doing the kids any benefit either. I mean, that would, to me, would actually be the worst case scenario. All distance learning would at least be consistent. I would like it. I don't think it's good for the kids. I don't think it's good for families, but at least it's not a logistical nightmare.
Maybe what we need to do is do what I've seen at a couple of gas stations and just drape the entire teacher's desk with a bunch of plastic. And then we can protect the staff. But
well, yeah, I mean, I think there's things you could, I mean, you could you could segment and protect your vulnerable population first.
Yeah.
Require the adults to wear masks and socially distance.
Yeah.
And you modify your classroom a little bit without causing the kids any great harm. I'm confident.
Yeah. And, you know, I think I've seen that there's only been, not that there haven't been hospitalizations or other problems with, you know, people who are under, you know, 20 years of age, but it's been like
very few. Yeah.
And I think even though like one death, it was originally reported that there were no underlying conditions, but it turned out like it was some like 17-year-old kid who was like 325 pounds and had diabetes.
Well, and parents, I mean, I'm sorry that this is going to resolve towards individual responsibility. Parents are going to have to make that call for themselves. They're just going to. You're going to have to say, my kid has got a pre-existing condition. And I hope, by the way, that schools do make distance learning an option for those who need it. I genuinely hope that. So if the hybrid model looks a lot more like that, where the kids come back, we're going to work on protecting our staff, and we're going to have an online option available for the kids who are at risk or who have family members who are at risk, that's a much better system. But I have just zero confidence that our politicians will come to the right solution. I have every confidence that our local elected officials would do that. I'm in fairly constant contact with one school board member in our community who I consider a good friend, and this is not all that complicated for them. This is basically what they would do, but they're subject to the state. And so now we're back to this question of, well, okay, why are we treating the Jordan public schools the same as the Minneapolis public schools?
That's a really good point too, because we're seeing outstate stuff in rural Montana completely different from the metro areas, but it does, I mean, my biggest fear as you were sharing your screen was just like those socioeconomic inescapable cycles that happen to minorities and to even, I mean, anybody who's poor. It doesn't matter the color of their skin. If they're in a situation where they need their job to feed their kids, and often school is, 90% education for their children, 10% babysitter so that they can go to work, this is just going to perpetuate the cycle even worse. That being now my biggest fear. Thankfully, I think my other fear is assuaged about having a president in 25 years who can't read the security briefings, because we already have that president. And we got to wrap up here because we talked about this ahead of time.
I have about a 1-minute clip here that I have not pre-screened, but if it's what I think it is, it will support this point, and it will also recall. We're going to do a callback to earlier in the show when I talked about a good politician has the ability to not only.
Let's do it. Garbled reply.
Before, I never slept over in Washington. I was in Washington, I think, 17 times. All of a sudden, I'm president of the United States. You know the story. I'm riding down Pennsylvania Avenue with our First Lady, and I say, this is great.
Well, this is going to just evolve into base anti-Trumpism, but that was the audio I wanted to share, and I wish they had played the whole response to it, and just to set the stage, which I probably should have done first. This is Trump on Sean Hannity's show. There's no bigger sycophant for Trump than Sean Hannity. He is not going to ask him anything but softball questions, and Trump cannot answer the softball questions. The softball questions, why should we elect you for a second term? What are your plans? Do you think maybe you might get answered that question, or asked that question rather? And the guy had absolutely no comment. And not only that, his response was worse because it was all about him. It was, which is probably legitimately why he cares about a second term, if I'm being frank.
Yeah. But, I think we need to dedicate a show to the two big things happening right now, which will probably be expired in 48 hours. But obviously this, not the original Bounty Gate, which was the Saints really destroying the Minnesota Vikings chance at a Super Bowl, which was pretty much guaranteed, I think. But now the new Bounty Gate that the Russians were paying the Taliban to kill U.S. soldiers. And his response was basically, I didn't know about it, which unsurprisingly appears to be a lie. Neither of us did enough research to talk about this in depth, but we promise lunatics will do that. But, you know, the interesting thing is that, to your point, like a politician would, at the very least, when asked about that, even if he said he was not aware of it, would express some sort of righteous indignation that the Russians were paying to kill U.S. soldiers. And that is completely absent from every one of his responses. No, he isn't upset that it's happening.
As a whatever I am partisan, don't hear what I'm not saying. I am lumping him absolutely into my contempt for politicians who cannot admit when they made a mistake. Is one of the biggest things that I just don't think I will ever understand is my full belief that people are very forgiving, that people make mistakes. We are flawed individuals. And for a politician to pretend that he or she is sort of beyond that capacity is just bizarre to me. I will never understand it as long as I live. Now, I'm not assuming that will happen to Donald Trump in my lifetime, but for other more competent politicians, a mea culpa is sometimes a really valuable thing, and it helps you politically.
Yeah, this is the only point I want to make about this, and then we have to wrap up the show, is that I've been saying now for a couple of weeks that what's interesting about Donald Trump is he is this, what I am calling a professional victim. And when you have an expert victim like that, it's only a matter of time before he is victimized by people. And he is continuously losing support by his biggest supporters. And that's what's going to cost him the election, because one by one, every one of them, he is alienating them. And that's why I think if the election were tomorrow, he's going to lose in a landslide. And I think it's only going to get worse, despite the fact that we have all of these like similarities with 2016. But the problem is now he's in the limelight and he's continuously creating or making himself out to be a victim by other people's circumstances, which alienates them. And that's just going to keep happening for the next 4 months.
Totally agree.
So, yeah. All right. We're going to talk in more depth, but we do have to go. Thanks everybody for tuning in to today's hotlou Happy Hour. I am your host, hotlou.
I'm going to screw up the back end just like I did the front end. Meatloaf. I screwed it up while I said I was screwing it up. Mike Loaf. I'm Mike Loaf. It says it on my screen. Bye.
Oh, God. Just see ya.